David Bernstein. I'm founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. This is the SpeechCast, a joint venture of the JILV and the Speech Project of the Jewish Journal. I'm delighted to have with us today Andrew Pessin. Andrew is a professor of philosophy at Connecticut College. He's also the campus editor for Allgemeiner, which is a Jewish publication that probably many of you have seen. He's written prolifically. He's the author of 3 novels and the author of a novel coming out soon called Evergreen, which oddly rhymes with evergreen. I don't know if that's a complete, coincidence. Probably not. You'll tell us. But Andrew, I'm really pleased to have you on today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've been, recently become aware of your work, and I'm really impressed with what you're doing. So I hope to become part of it as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you're here to talk about your work. So before we talk about sort of the broader ideological environment, you've written this novel. Tell us what it's about.
Okay, so as you astutely noticed, Evergreen rhymes with Evergreen. Evergreen State College being a college that was very much in the news a few years back. It's a very progressive, left-leaning sort of place. And Professor Brett Weinstein became the target of a cancellation campaign. I won't go into all the details here unless you want more details. A few years back. The book is not about Evergreen, but it takes as its inspiration the college that it is sort of named after is meant to reach out to Evergreen. This is a book about the campus cancel culture, which is running fairly rampantly throughout many, many campuses, not all campuses and not all the time, but it is a very prominent phenomenon over the last few years. The Evergreen State one was a particularly prominent one that caught a lot of news attention and launched a new career for Professor Brett Weinstein and his wife. But this has been going on for a while. It's certainly been going on with respect to Jewish students, and especially pro-Israel Jewish students on campuses who have been facing cancel campaigns for really up to 20 years now, almost, on campuses in different degrees, different places. So the novel is about this phenomenon, campus cancel culture, and it is really meant to show clearly, what it's like to be the target of a cancel campaign. It's to show how unhinged these can be, both in their level of emotion and in their connection to reality. I will also say, we can go into more detail there as well. And it's meant to expose what happens when ideology just gets too excessive, when people become absorbed by ideologies and they can no longer tolerate the presence in their midst of any alternative viewpoint or argument or point of view or something like that. Part of this comes from, I consider myself a very classic liberal, absolutely a proponent of free speech to the maximum degree. We can talk more about that if you'd like as well. Sure. And what we're seeing on campuses as part of this campus cancel culture, and just I assume your listeners are familiar with it, but if they're not, the basic idea in cancel culture is that there is a very dominant orthodoxy on the campus. And when someone ruffles the feathers, it's sometimes a professor will say something or write something. Sometimes it's a visiting speaker. Someone's invited to come to campus. When this alternative point of view is presented that the dominant orthodoxy sees as threatening or harmful, they erupt in anger. They call to any number of different things. If it's an invited speaker, they certainly call to disinvite that speaker. If it's a professor on campus, they will typically call for punishment, sanction, demand the person apologize, retract, etc. And so that's what happens on these campuses. And it's clearly a major affront to the ideal of a campus, at least in my mind. Ideal of a campus is a fundamentally neutral environment where people with different points of view sort of come into the neutral forum and argue it out by rational deliberation and rational debate, etc. To me, that is the heart and soul of what a university should be. It's the heart and soul of what universities, if not always were, but at least aspired to be in the past. And cancel culture is a direct threat to that by essentially demanding that a certain orthodoxy reigns supreme, and any disagreement or dissidence to that has to not merely be debated and disagreed with, but ultimately silenced and eliminated. So that's what's driving this book. I wanted to get across what these cancel campaigns look like, what they feel like, and really emphasize that they're the product of ideologies run amok.
Right. The only other novel I can think of on cancel culture is The Human Stain by Philip Roth. Can you think of any other novel that's been addressed this?
Yes, as a matter of fact, The Human Stain, excellent book. Scott Johnston published a novel just 2 years ago called Campus Land, which was less about, it was about cancel culture for sure. It was a little bit more of a direct attack on sort of liberal progressive ideas on campuses and the grip they've taken over campuses. But it certainly featured sort of front and center a professor who was subject to a cancel campaign. It was actually, it was really an excellent novel. I do recommend it to people to check out. And it's funny because I'll mention one thing about it. I actually finished my own novel. It was ready to go exactly 2 years ago at just when his novel came out, and it was enough of a competition. And as it turned out, I knew him back in college, so somebody I knew. As it turned out, I thought, you know what, his novel came out. I put mine on hold for a little bit to let his novel have its space, and it did extremely well. It drew a very positive response. So I recommend it. Campus Land by Scott Johnston.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I've looked you up, obviously, and I saw that you were the target of a bit of a campaign yourself back in maybe 2015. Are you able to talk about that?
No, I'm not able to talk about that, and people can find it out for themselves. But let me just merely say that the coverage that particular episode got, it taught me something very, very important. Every article that I read about it, and even the ones that were favorable to me, which were the large majority, because the truth was on my side, got something wrong, like some key fact, right? And I realized that was an important lesson for me. I think we all have a tendency. You read a story, you read something on the news, and you feel like you get it. And what I saw there, when for a little while I was in the news, was that every single story got at least one key fact wrong, and usually an important fact. And so I've learned then, in fact, just this morning, I read a story online about a professor who's suing a student. You don't usually see that, but a professor who's suing the university and the student because Fairfield University in Connecticut basically overrode the professor's grade to the student, right? So it was a little story and, sort of curious. And I realized my first thought was how outrageous the university did this, but I remembered enough from my own experience to say, you know what, I don't know all the facts. If I want to pursue it further, I certainly can. So I think that's a good lesson for all of us. And it actually ties right into free speech ideas, which is
I had a colleague who used to say, even when they're right, they're wrong. And it's true, when you've been doing news in the news long enough, you realize that the best coverage you'll ever have will always get one thing wrong. And it reminds us to really do due diligence.
Yeah, so absolutely. And it really, I think, connects into some thoughts about like the importance and nature of free speech, which is, in my own case, maybe I'm naive, but I always start, my default position is to assume the opponent, the ideological opponent, let's say the person I'm disagreeing with, is a person of goodwill and good faith, and that we're all in the same business, which is we're trying to get at the truth. And we recognize we have different opinions. We might be aware of different facts, or we might have different understandings of the facts, but the other person, to assume they're of goodwill and good faith, is to respect them as an interlocutor, and then to rightfully engage with what they have to say and maybe refute it, or or however the conversation goes. But I always want to start with that assumption until proven otherwise. And not everyone is of goodwill or of good faith and has the same motives I do, but I'll start with that as an assumption. And so when I read an article, and especially we all tend to read in our little bubbles a little bit, so I'll read articles condemning anti-Zionism on campus. Even there, when I hear how the other side, the Israel haters, are being represented in the article, I always try to remind myself, I don't know the whole story. I'm only hearing it through this lens. Let me find out more. And indeed, I do think a lot of irrational hatred on that other side. But my starting point is always, at least when I'm dealing with individuals, assume there's a little more to the story, assume I don't know their full perspective. And I personally think that's a healthy way to go. If you believe in free speech, then you have to believe that, right? I think so.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I know that you're a passionate Zionist, as well as a free speecher. Um, to what degree do you see the sort of anti-Israel ideological trends on campus related to the current illiberal environment more generally on campus?
That's a great question, an enormous question, as you well know, right? So, I would say I became aware first of anti-Zionism as a cancel campaign on campuses over the last 10 years and more. It really traces all the way back at least to Durban 20 years ago, facing the 20th anniversary of that Durban
Right, coming
conference, the
up.
UN, right. So that's really where the modern version of it traces back to. It started appearing on campuses like almost immediately after Durban in the early aughts of 2000. So, my first thought, and that was the one, we all care about the things we care about, and I care about Israel. So was very aware of Israel being targeted on campuses, and that was really early cancel campaigns. In the last number of years, it's hard to trace the beginning of this, and it was certainly magnified in the Trump era, I believe. The cancel campaign has grown in scope and grown in the degree of its targets, and really, by and large, and we all read these statistics, university campuses are overwhelmingly like left progressive in their nature. Some, you hear statistics like 95% of faculty members identify as Democrats or left as opposed to right or conservative, right? So universities are these bubbles of most of them, obviously there's exceptions, these bubbles of sort of left progressivism. And cancel culture has expanded to become anything that's considered right or conservative, right? So in my mind, first it's Zionism that's targeted for cancellation on many campuses. The BDS on campus, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement against Israel, is a cancel campaign, right? They're trying to just eliminate the presence of Zionist voices and eliminate interactions with Israelis, Israeli culture, Israeli academics, certainly Israeli economics. So BDS is a cancel campaign. And now, of course, in the last few years, anything seen as right or conservative, and in fact, I think it's getting so extreme, anything seen as merely liberal, but not far left, is already being targeted now, right? So it's this far left movement targeting all these things. So on the one hand, two separate cancel campaigns, but on the other hand, and this was your question now, right? On the other hand, that it's often been said that Jews are the canary in the coal mine, right? First they come for, well, actually in the famous thing, they come for other people before they come for the Jews. No, maybe they come for the Jews first. What's the, first they came for the.
I think it might have been the Jews, but
it might have been the Jews. Yeah, right. Well, anyway, you can take the sort of the temperature of a culture by how they treat their Jews. This is like an old idea, and so they came for the Jews first. But as we're seeing now, as the ideology expands and grows, and the very sort of pretty far left ideologies that are gripping a lot of campuses now, the Jews are essentially just identified with the right and the conservative in the mind's eye. And certainly Israel is represented, just to put it, very simply, Israel is represented as a bastion of white supremacy, oppressing people of color, the Palestinians. That's how Israel is seen on many of these campuses. And so in that move, you've got both cancel campaigns just merged into one, right? It's targeting the Jews and it's targeting the right and the conservative by equating the Jews with the right and the conservative. And that comes to a head when you think of Israel as dominated by white supremacy, which is, about as absurd and ridiculous a claim as you could imagine, but it is a dominant persuasive claim in many circles on campuses.
Yeah. So let me see if I can bring out attention here. You're a free speaker, you're a Zionist, I'm both as well. Some people in our camp, on the Zionist camp, have tried to invoke sort of the hostile environment standard on campuses, whereby they could argue that, the apartheid campaign on campus X is producing a hostile environment for Jewish students on campus, and that the university is therefore liable and must change that environment, and presumably then put a stop to the apartheid week. Yeah, clearly that's also a free speech issue. I mean, the people who are doing apartheid campaigns have free speech. How do you navigate those tensions?
Fantastic questions, David. I'm very impressed. Thank you. Hard questions, right? So, like any other human being, I don't like hearing things I consider to be hateful, right? And especially as a Jewish person and a Zionist, I feel like I walk around with a kind of target on my back, and not just a metaphorical one sometimes. And so, as soon as an atmosphere becomes dominated by, let's start off by saying Israel critical talk, that's kind of a euphemism, right? Critical of Israel, critical of Israeli policies, even that makes me uncomfortable. I feel targeted, right? If I identify with this state of Israel in many ways, part of my Jewish identity is absolutely connected to my Zionism, then criticism of Israel is felt uncomfortably, and I don't want to hear it. I prefer not to hear it, right? Because I'm a normal human being. However, as a free speecher, I recognize and I want to believe that start off with believing that my opponents have goodwill and good faith, and they use some very wonderful language. They're in favor of justice and human rights and freedom of people. Like, of course, sign me up for that, right? I'm in favor of that. So believing they're people of good faith and of goodwill, I personally, I permit that, right? Like, not that I have any power on what gets said here, but I certainly defend the right of individuals to criticize Israel, even a lot, on campuses. However, when what we're calling criticism of Israel becomes something else, and these are very hard things to define. Right now, there's a whole war going on over how do you define anti-Semitism and when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitic, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like you can specify clearly and explicitly and fully in advance when that line is crossed, but pretty clearly, speech that incites violence has to be suppressed. And I think most free speechers can agree with that, right? And then
I agree with that.
These are gray zones. When does speech incite violence? I don't know. Certainly, if it endorses violence, if it calls for violence, that should be prohibited. And by the way, many anti-Zionist campaigns on campus are quite explicit. They call for intifada explicitly. Right? I mean, intifada is a violent campaign of resistance. But
it's not directly aimed at this. Presumably, it might be, but if it's not directly aimed at the students on that campus, you could argue it's still a free speech issue.
Maybe these are interesting individual cases, right? But even when they're not saying, and by the Jews are targeted for vandalism quite a bit, and there's been pushing and shoving, et cetera, on some campuses, et cetera.
Obviously, not a free speech issue. That's problematic, right?
Yeah, right. And even just the general support of terrorism. So whether it's the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is designated a terrorist organization, that's getting a lot of positive spin on a number of campuses these days, and they're openly endorsing people who hijack planes, right? So then it gets a little bit more problematic. Even if they're not threatening people on your campus, they are, and by the way, there are Israeli students on campus. So when you are endorsing and supporting people who've committed acts of violence against Israelis, and there are Israeli students on your campus, seems to me you're certainly starting to get into the problem. You're well into the problematic zone there. That said, here's the thing that really bugs me the most, because my own default would be allow as much speech as possible until it's pretty clearly threatening, encouraging, endorsing violence, right? That's when I push back. And that means the stuff, Israel criticism, if it's really criticism of Israeli policies, absolutely has to be allowed. As we know, the hostility towards Israel on campus is often hostility towards the very existence of Israel. So that's a little bit more problematic than merely criticizing Israeli policies. But again, once it gets into explicit support for violence, it clearly has to be reined in. And at the very least, has no place on a college campus. It just like in terms of the norms of a campus shouldn't become a proxy for a conflict going on elsewhere, right? So Israelis and Palestinians are in a conflict that some becomes physical and bloody fairly regularly. We don't want to import that to our campuses where, let's say, the pro-Palestinian students are literally fist fighting, or worse, the pro-Israel students. The whole idea of a university is ideally, we step out of the messiness of the world, and here we get to think about it and talk about it. And so as soon as some groups start endorsing the violence, I think, even if it should be allowed by free speech considerations, it's antithetical to the norms of the university. So the last thing I'll say on that subject is, What really bothers me, and this is a classic thing, is the double standard towards these views. So what we see on campuses is anything, and this is the cancel culture, right? Anything that's remotely seen as racist or homophobic or transphobic or even Islamophobic is just shut down immediately on the campus and by the administration, et cetera, et cetera. But the tolerance for what I'll call anti-Semitic discourse is way, way higher than it is for all these other discourses. And so I believe in free speech, which means, you know what, I believe people should say things that other people may consider to be racist, because that's part of free speech. But what I can't tolerate is that you'll shut down all of the level of toleration for racism, et cetera, is very, very low, but the toleration for anti-Semitism is way, way high. And that has to be equalized.
Right. Well, although you could argue that puts us in a funny dilemma. We can either stick up for the free speech standard and say everybody should be able to say those things, or we can say, I'm sorry, you're being a hypocrite, and so we're going to try to shut you down just as we would be shut down, or somebody else would be shut down if they violated other standards of bigotry. So I think it's I think, and I'm sort of aligned with that former camp of saying, let's us stand up for free speech, because ultimately, by the way, an ideological, intellectual environment that's anti-free speech will be much worse for us than one that's applied equally to us. And that ultimately Jews are better off, the Jews and other citizens are better off in an environment that respects the tradition of free speech.
I agree, but now this is how they've got you, because in order to stand up for that view, and you heard me sort of struggling with it, you now have to say, as I just said, I defend the right of the racist to be a racist on campus, right? So that position, which is ideologically pure and beautiful, right? Like what you're saying, I think you're absolutely right. The way the campus environment is structured now means you're defending the racists and the homophobes and the transphobes and the Islamophobes.
Right.
And, and that means we're losing at the moment, right? So I don't know what the right strategy is to win. I think you're right. We should support free speech, but where it is right now is to support free speech is to support the people they are, and by the way, I should say, typically wrongly calling racist is, homophobes, transphobes, et cetera, right? Et cetera. And so maybe the better strategy, at least in the environment we're in right now, is the other one that I was mentioning, which is we need to make sure if you're going to be shut down, if you're going to limit free speech because of racism, et cetera, then you also have to apply the same standard to the anti-Semitism, right? Like we have to.
Right. I'm fighting the former, by the way. I just want to make that very clear.
Yeah.
Because I'm fighting for free speech and liberalism, and I have to apply that equally, and I want to apply it equally, by the way, as well. I want to though put forward another sort of strategic dilemma I think the Jewish community / pro-Israel community is facing in the current ideological environment. I think for many groups, certainly on the center left, the instinct is to say that we can't control the larger ideological framework that's in place in whatever institutions we're in, whatever society we're in. So what we have to make sure that we do is make sure that anti-Semitism is treated equally and fairly and so forth. So this led a lot of Jewish groups, by the way, to want to engage with the Black Lives Matter movement. On the same similar defense, by the way, because they're saying, look, at least I'll have a chance, or on the Women's March movement, for example, at least I'll have a chance to make the case that they have an uncomplicated view of Israel and Zionism and Jews, and therefore correct it where I can, not with everybody, not with Linda Sarsour's, but at least with some of the more moderates within those camps, and I'll be able to move them in our direction. And I think, by the way, there's a good argument that they've been successful at times at doing that. There were people within the Women's March movement who did get Israel off the agenda of the Women's March. That said, now there's another argument that, well, this ideology has gotten so widespread, is so potent, and is so potentially fueling of anti-Semitism that we're just playing a game of whack-a-mole, and the real long game has to be to oppose the ideology. And the more we make that compromise with the ideology and sort of maximize our own position, the more we are actually feeding the ideology that is putting Jews in harm's way. What do you think of that?
I'm a depressing person to speak to because I don't see a way out, right? It looks very dark to me, and your eloquent description there just reinforces how dark this is. I don't know what the way out here is, and I see, the Jewish community is famously divided from the beginning of time, right? Like two Jews, three opinions, etc. And it's all the more divided over Israel now, and it's also just torn apart. In fact, just recently there was this this rally against anti-Semitism in Washington D.C., which was just all these internal divisions writ large, because the rally was trying to figure out, it wanted to be a supportive of Israel rally, but if you're too supportive of Israel, then all the Jews from like the center and the left are going to be uncomfortable going to it. And there was like tons of discussion. Groups like, for example, Zionists. I don't know if you're familiar with that, right?
Well, yes.
Yeah, right. I love the idea of them. But there's lots of people who are making the argument against them.
They're playing that internal game, by the way. I mean, I understand it, by the way. That's the game I played, a game. I don't want to call it a game. That was the strategy that I undertook in most of my professional life, and argued for it and wrote about it and said, this is the best we can do, is to fight within the ideology, because we don't control the ideology. We don't control the parameters of discourse in a society. And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to shut down Zionists, or even, by the way, groups like AIPAC that still have to play within the internal parameters of the ideology.
Right.
I'm saying that maybe the lion's share of our psychic energy and strategic energy have to go into fighting the ideology rather than the other way around. And that more groups have to join the battle against the ideology itself.
So in other words, let me just mention this. A couple of years ago, I published this book, Anti-Zionism on Campus, which collects narratives of both faculty members and students who were, basically targets of cancel campaigns for not even for standing up for Israel, but for simply not hating Israel. Like, the bar is pretty low. Like, unless you hate Israel, you're an enemy, right? And so one of the stories in there was from a young woman, a student at Oberlin, and it was right at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and she was like all in. I mean, she's left, liberal, fighting racism, all in on that. But then you might remember when the Black Lives Matter formed, like, their early platform had this anti-Israel aspect to it.
Black Lives, right?
Movement for Black Lives, yeah. Right. And she writes beautifully in this book about like this dilemma that she has, because she's like a fierce Zionist and a fierce progressive. And these people put her in an impossible situation. This is how she felt it anyway, which is like, how can I be part of a movement which condemns my identity, which is how she experienced that. And, what it highlights too is, in my view, and Black Lives Matter in subsequent iterations has only doubled down on that, right? They came out, full anti-Zionist, certainly in the recent conflict as well. And, what that brings out so painfully is, like, I don't get it. Like, why would the Black Lives Matter want to include this? Because to me, whatever's going on in, Israel-Palestinian conflict has nothing to do with the important issues of racism in the United States. And why do you do that, which automatically will alienate an important constituency? Because we know Jews, at least non-religious Jews, which are the large majority of American Jews, lean left liberal, right? They want to be part of these progressive causes. They want to be at the leadership in these progressive causes. And you're suddenly, by this decision, and I don't know how the internal decision-making processes go there, by this decision, you're basically saying to many Jews, you're not welcome here. And then, some Jews will take the strategy you mentioned, which is, well, I can overlook that clause because I agree with 90%, but other Jews, like this woman here, it's like, I can't be part of this group. So
they're not using the same model for civil rights as their forebears.
They reject it explicitly. Yeah,
they reject it explicitly, but it's very basic that they're not, in my view, trying to build a coalition, a traditional coalition that spans sort of ideological perspectives as well. They're trying to instill a particular ideology into the body politic that ultimately sort of undoes the terms of what they would call whiteness, or a white dominated culture. So that's, their agenda is different. And if we keep on insisting that, well, this is just a new iteration of the traditional civil rights movement, and we're going to connect with it, and they're going to eventually like us, I think we're probably fooling ourselves about that, because that's not their agenda.
So I never answered your question, which is, I agree with you, right? Like, I think it's a lost cause, right? Like, and I admired Zion. Here's what happens. So Zionists, for example, undertaking the strategy. And I see a lot to admire in it. And I understand the motivation of it, right? There's like a lot of good thinking there. I really do believe
No
that.
question.
But then, Trump, of course, makes everything enormous and complicated, just wherever you stand on Trump. But, what I see on the more right, they're now called right, to be pro-Israel is somehow identified as a right-wing position, which is just crazy in my mind. But nevertheless, in the discourse we currently have, the more right-leaning circles that I'm aware of also, you can't deny that Trump was, I think, very good for Israel. I mean, I'll defend that, right? Trump did all things really strong pro-Israel people want, like powerful things, unprecedented things, right? But groups like Zionists are now in a tough position because they want to be Zionists, and as Zionists, I would argue you should at least support those Trump's Israel-related policies, right? But they can't, because if you're trying to, and I'll put it in strong language, appease the progressive movement because you want to be part of them, you don't want to be expelled from them, you have to become, and you may have a lot to object to in Trump from your progressive perspective as well, I get that, but you can't in that moment support the pro-Israel moves that this guy is making because you're so busy, I'll say, capitulating to or appeasing, the anti-Israel movements. And so, that brought these tensions out enormously large, and it brought within the Jewish community as well. And I share with you the view that we're not going to make progress by getting them to like us and by working with them at this point. I think they've made it clear they don't want us.
We tried, and it is possible, by the way, that we should not only tolerate but hope for divergent strategic approaches within the Jewish community. In other words, we want the Zionists to continue doing that to a degree.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I look at the ethnic studies program. I don't know to what degree you follow this in California.
I have, through Amcha and Tammy Rossman Besman.
Right. So look at So there were two camps within the sort of Jewish community on that. One, well, probably more, but two, let's say, mainstream camps. One which were saying that this curriculum is just problematic because it's based on critical race ideology, and no matter what, it's going to continue to be bad. There was another that said, let's get the best deal we possibly can. Let's fight within it. Groups like the JCRC, San Francisco, did just that. And they were at odds with each other because the people who were trying to just bring down the curriculum felt that if the other camp had joined forces with them, they would have been able to stop the curriculum altogether. I'm not sure that that's the case, by the way. But let's assume it wasn't the case. There is an argument that says the Jewish community should have a diversified portfolio on these matters, and that it's okay, even if I think ultimately it's better to mostly fight against the ethnic studies curriculum. I'm not so sure that I want everybody to do it. I don't want somebody to say they may win, so let's make sure that anti-Semitism is portrayed in the best possible, most accurate possible way within the curriculum. So that's what I'm playing around with, and it's a tough mental balancing act, and in the meantime, I'm at least putting my energies into saying we've got to fight this ideology.
Yeah, I agree. And just so you know, as I mentioned earlier, to be seen as the person fighting the ideology will be to label yourself as a racist in these environments, right? And the cost of that is so enormous that there's a lot of pressure on certainly, like, say, faculty members, either to suppress your views or not take on the battle straightforward. Like, there's a few big heavy hitters that are really, taking on the ideology full force, and they've got the security and confidence to be able to do that.
Bigger can do it because he's not going to get fired. He's just too powerful of an academic force.
Exactly, and a John McWhorter, Glenn Lurie, right? Yeah, but those are the exceptions, far from the rule. And what we have on the campus is you have people afraid to. John McWhorter actually said this recently too. He said he knows there are so many people who agree with him on campus, as faculty members, etc. And he hears all the time people are afraid to say anything, right? Like the silent majority. It might well be a silent majority because even some people on the left are upset at how extreme cancel culture has become now, right? Like, and
in my mind, that's the case. I mean, I get these emails and calls every day. Yeah, I agree with you. I can't come out right now. I mostly agree with you. So there's a lot of that happening. And to me, the enterprise that we're working on now is to create as much safety in numbers as possible, so that people will increasingly put themselves on the line, and it is a risk. There's no question. We shouldn't deny the risk, so that we'll be able to we'll carve out space for those voices. And eventually some of those will be people on the extremes will be exposed as being the minority voices that they actually are.
Yeah, and it's hard to know where we are now, just to go back to your original point a couple of moments ago, but like it's hard to know in advance what's the best strategy to take, right? Like in retrospect, when you look back, you do historical analysis, you obviously 2020 hindsight, but do you work with the group or do you exclude yourself? One thing that really struck me, and again, I'm focused on the university primarily, but during the recent conflict in Gaza, we saw just such shocking extremism from the academy against Israel, right? I don't know if you saw literally hundreds of statements, entire departments of universities, not merely siding with the Palestinians. Like I can get that, right? But issuing these statements that were just so unbelievably one-sided, condemning Israel. They don't even mention for defending itself, because they don't even mention the Hamas rockets, which are the reason Israel's attacking Gaza at that point, right? All they see is there's Israel carpet bombing Gaza again, which of course is totally false. So what we saw is not merely in quantity, literally hundreds of statements, entire departments signed by, I kid you not, tens of thousands of faculty, students, and staff, etc., all against Israel. But then the quality of the statements, not only just being one-sided, as I mentioned, but openly embracing the one-sidedness. I cannot tell you, clearly there was a boilerplate that was circulating, because many of them said things like the following: we're not going to fall for calling this a two-sided conflict, right? Like, we're not going to look for the other side, because there is no other side. So these are academics who say there's only one side to the story, right? And that side is just filled with such vitriol and hatred. It's unreal. So this was very scary. And this feeling, I don't see how you could be a Jewish student on campus unless you're, an Israel-hating anti-Zionist Jewish student, which is a minority, but they're there. But anyone else, as long as you don't hate Israel, but certainly if you're pro-Israel, how you cannot feel as you return to your campus in the fall, like you've got a target on your back, right? If this is what the academy erupted clearly in its position, that the Jews are evil and need to be eliminated. That's the only way to understand these statements, in my view. How can Jewish students and Jewish faculty members return to campus at business as usual in the fall? And so the environment is so scary, and that's part of what I'm, trying to capture in here, is what it feels like to be targeted. It feels like you are being hunted down, right? Hunted down for elimination. A little bit later, a little bit of pushback came to those statements. So a few universities, a few places pushed out statements saying, not even defending Israel so much, but expressing alarm at the one-sidedness, and whole departments signing these statements, which is so problematic from an academic point of view, in my opinion. There was a little bit of pushback at a number of places. I think at Columbia University there was one. UC Davis had a few. But what you noticed about these things, and this is the key point, first of all, the numbers were much smaller, like, a couple of dozen, I think, at UC Davis, maybe a little bit more at Columbia. Almost all the names are Jewish names on these lists, visibly Jewish names, right? And what the message I take from that is, we're alone, right? We're alone. We don't have allies, because the intersectional coalitions which the universities have established have now produced a situation where almost everyone is in a coalition against the Jews. The Jews stand alone, which I think reinforces your point now. We can't work within those coalitions.
So I think that there's going to be allies in this. They're already coming into formation, and we have a lot of work to do to piece it together and to give it the kind of strength that it needs.
Yeah.
Andrew, I really appreciate your time and your good luck with the novel.
Thank you.
Yes, Evergreen.
It can be found at andrewpessin.com. If you want more information about me, my work, and the book itself is at andrewpessin.com. And I'm hoping it will be. Do I have 2 more minutes? I'm hoping it will be one more tool in this battle for the following reason. So there's lots of different strategies. As you said, we need our portfolio to be diverse, etc. But, as Saul Alinsky famous said in Rules for Radicals, like, ridicule is the most potent weapon. And I think, not that my book could reach this status, but, Spinal Tap, which I think is the greatest movie ever made, possibly, if you ever saw that movie, this satirical mockery of, like, the heavy metal world. There was a documentary some years later about heavy metal, and like several of the heavy metal artists said after Spinal Tap, they could no longer be what they were, because like Spinal Tap was so successful in its mockery of them that when they were just being themselves, they felt foolish suddenly, right? Like, it actually changed the way. So my aspiration.
Become excellent at mocking it.
Right. This could get out, like the mockery of this thing, so that the people who then perpetrate it can feel foolish, right? Like that's another tool. So that's my aspiration for this. Not that I could compare
Beautiful.
myself to Spinal Tap, but
Well,
I should be so lucky.